Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. What does it mean to truly see an organization? Dr. David Krackhardt has spent decades answering that question, not through organization charts or job titles, but through the invisible web of relationships that actually drives how work gets done. Listeners, we are honored to welcome Dr. David Krackhardt as our distinguished guest on today's episode. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. David Krackhardt is a professor of organizations and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy with a joint appointment at the Tepper School of Business. A pioneer in organizational network analysis, Professor David introduced the concept of cognitive social structures, a groundbreaking framework that captures how individuals perceive the networks around them, not just how those networks objectively exist. This distinction, subtle yet profound, has shaped how scholars and practitioners understand power, reputation, and why people really leave their jobs. His methodological contributions are equally influential, from adapting the quadric assignment procedure for network regression to developing graph theoretic tools for mapping organizational structure. Professor David has built much of the scaffolding that modern network researchers rely on. His ongoing work pushes further still, examining how controversial innovations spread, how visual network representations shape our understanding, and the outsized role of Simmelian ties, those rare, super strong bonds in organizational life. Professor David's scholarship weaves together psychology, sociology, anthropology, and management, the work of a mind that refuses to be confined by disciplinary boundaries. Before joining Carnegie Mellon, he held faculty positions at Cornell, the University of Chicago, INSEAD, and Harvard Business School, a trajectory that speaks for itself. Dr. David holds a BS from MIT and a PhD from University of California, Irvine. Born in Massachusetts in 1950, he is married with three children. In today's episode, Dr. David Krackhardt joins us to explore the key insights from his research, online knowledge communities, breaking or sustaining knowledge silos. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Krackhardt to the conversation. Professor David, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our kind invitation.
Well, thank you, Deepak. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your research reveals a striking paradox that even in a globally connected online platform, employees still gravitate toward sharing knowledge with people nearby or in the same specialty. What does that tell us about human nature versus technology's promise?
Well, it is true that people do tend to gravitate towards people that have very familiar vocabularies, backgrounds, understandings, or may share lots of other characteristics or beliefs. And that's just human nature. We call it homophily. And we find strong propensities towards that. The problem is most of our learning, most of our innovations come from rubbing up against people who think differently than we do. And oftentimes that requires doing something a little bit uncomfortable. Networks are kind of the underpinning of what happens in organizations because they're sort of this safety net that helps an organization as it crashes, as it kind of implodes from its own bureaucracy. And networks help it keep going as it sinks down into the bureaucratic abyss. So they're really important, but if networks are confined to simply those groups that are already defined organizationally or demographically to others that are very similar to them, then you lose the opportunity to not only learn, but to, in fact, respond to perhaps, for example, one of the things we found is that organizations, when they face crises, when there's a big threat to the organization, we tend to gravitate towards helping each other who we know really well, that is our close ties in the networks. And if those are all coalesced around little bubbles, then what happens is the bubbles don't every bubble tries to protect itself. Its identity is wrapped up in that bubble, and as a result they don't do the necessary cooperative kinds of behaviors with other bubbles or other parts of the organization that allow the entire organization to survive. If people identify with their own little bubble, their own department, their own little group, R&D group or manufacturing group, and they don't have any links at all to other parts, then what they'll do is, in the face of a crisis, is rally the horses around the campfire and protect their own campfire, and that's not going to be healthy for the organization as a whole. So there are lots of reasons that we want to encourage a broader reaching out beyond what's really comfortable or natural. We call them natural silos, because if you leave networks to themselves without inducing or encouraging any kind of bridging across those, then those silos develop naturally, and they're not, in the long run, they're not healthy for the organization.
Professor, the internet was supposed to erase borders. Yet, your data from a Fortune 500 consulting firm tells a different story. Would you say companies have been oversold on the idea that digital platforms alone can dissolve knowledge silos?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the examples of both, there are two particularly critical advantages to this bridging kind of networking that I just mentioned. And one is, as I say, in the face of crisis and threat, when you need, people will tend to rally around their close, well-known networks instead of cooperating across. So inducing the kind of cooperation necessary requires trust. It requires some emotional ability to connect and identify with people in other parts of the organization, such that their identity themselves is not wrapped up in there, but is bridging to other parts of the organization. What we find is platforms are particularly good, electronic platforms, and even listservs, where people are interacting. It's not just electronic information flowing, but it's people connecting through. What happens is those channels tend to propagate instrumental kinds of information that's particular to solving a technical problem. That's not the kind of tie that really becomes critical when you're talking about these crisis situations, these threatening situations, or when you're talking about the kinds of work necessary that induces innovation. Innovation also often comes from hooking up people with who are not necessarily in their own from very familiar bailiwick, their own familiar background, their own familiar specialty. That oftentimes real innovation happens when they kind of bridge to and develop relations with those other people. We have what technology has done is allow information to flow like crazy. I mean, so information is available. Information is readily available, and information can be very valuable for solving particular, especially technological problems. But when it comes to developing the kinds of trust that really is required to make an operation cooperative, or make an operation innovative, those kinds of relations require more than just information flow. They require really relationship building and not just information exchange. And that's, I think, not going to be. Our experience is that that platforms don't necessarily help build those kinds of relations that are more human relations and those kinds of relations are better ignited anyway through face-to-face interaction. And there's nothing, even the best Zoom pixel camera uh, doesn't replace a face-to-face kind of interaction. So Deepak, I look forward to seeing you in person someday when we can be physically closer together. And I guarantee the kinds of exchange we'll have will be richer than simply what we're going to be able to do over a camera. And I believe that's true in organizations in general.
Thank you, Professor, for your kind invitation. I would love to meet you in person. Professor, when knowledge circulates only within familiar clusters, what are the real productivity costs that companies may not even realize they are incurring? And how do those
Yeah.
losses compound over time?
Well, again, the real problem is since information is so readily available, it's making it almost too easy for everybody to be comfortable with the kind of stuff. They don't have to go outside their little nest to get answers to questions. And so the real problem is they never get an opportunity to build across and develop those bridging ties unless they're encouraged to do so by the organization. Over time, these natural silos become calcified. They become reified. They become so solid, so strong that they become even more difficult to get out of. And again, it impacts on a person's identity. They no longer identify as an employee of General Motors. They identify as I am in this particular group, R&D group or IT group or marketing group and I deal with this one small part of the market. That's my group. And if that's all you do, and that's all the information you get, and you never develop those, they become stronger and stronger, more difficult to break out of. And in the long run, that's not going to help an organization adapt and grow and meet the fast changing environment that we're all facing today.
But despite virtual access, geographic proximity still shape who share knowledge with whom. Is this a
Yeah.
technological failure, a cultural one, or simply an unavoidable feature of how humans build trust?
Well, first of all, it is natural. There's a lot of research on this. We know that it's very natural. Uh, People naturally look to develop social relations with people who are similar to themselves, both in terms of beliefs and attitudes, as well as some demographic characteristics. And we just that's a natural human process. It takes effort to kind of break out of those bubbles. They can become bubbles if you let them. And I am not sure what the future is going to be because the technology is changing so quickly. But there is something called the law of propinquity. I don't know. Have you heard of this? The law of propinquity?
Yes, I have
The
already.
law, yeah, the law of propinquity is very simply that people who are physically close to each other will tend to interact much more frequently than people who are physically farther apart, which is a very natural, obvious kind of law, because if you're far apart, you don't get a chance to interact. But now with technology, the idea was it was going to break the law of propinquity. That is, no longer would it be necessary to be physically close to people. But what we have empirically found is that even in the face of this modern technology, that what's happening is we are interacting with this technology with people who have the office next door to us more often than people down the hall. And we interact over this technology with people down the hall more than with people on another floor, and people on another floor more than people in another building, and so on. It's the physical, the law of propinquity and physical proximity has a huge impact. Even, and so far, we have not found a technology that breaks it. Um, One of the most interesting pieces of work I've seen is done by the computer scientists who look at email systems and listserv systems over, we're talking kilometers. And what they find is people respond to others on this large international system with this inverse square law, the law of propinquity, which says that I'm going to respond on a listserv, even, independent of what they're asking. I'm going to respond to them if they're physically closer to me, and that goes out for miles. And as a matter of fact, it goes out. That curve, that inverse curve, actually goes out for about 1,000 kilometers. 1,000 kilometers. Imagine that. That somehow we have a sense of physically, well, they're so far away. Why should I bother answering that question without really even knowing what department or anything that they're in? But that pattern just seems to be there. So far, the law of propinquity has not been broken by technology. Now, I say that with a caveat. One of the things that COVID did is force us to use technology and become dependent on technology and comfortable. I mean, Zoom blossomed because of COVID. As a result of that, many, especially young people, have kind of grown up in a completely different world than the world I grew up in. It is possible that the combination of this new technology and the COVID experience forcing people to rely on this technology might, we might find that the law of propinquity changes. So this idea of proximity having an effect might change. I'm skeptical, but I'm open to data. And if the science, we're just starting to really uncover what this effect might be in the long term. And we don't know the answer to the question of whether proximity and propinquity is going to really matter as much in the future as it has in the past. We don't know yet. And it could be that the next generation of people will change our ways of interacting and developing relationships and the implications for organizations. I am willing to be convinced by data. So far, I'm not convinced. So far, the law of propinquity has still held its ground.
Professor, your study found that specialty borders are just as powerful as geographic ones in limiting knowledge flow. In knowledge-intensive industries like consulting, why are cross-specialty conversations so rare and so valuable when they do happen?
Yeah. Um, it depends on the specialty. It really does depend on the kinds of problems that the organization is working on. But if you take as a great example in the medical field, specialties happen because the depth of knowledge that is so critical to becoming an expert on a particular disease or a particular malady is is so demanding that it's and also again fast changing, technologically fast changing in terms of dealing with current ways of addressing those ills, uh, that you almost have no time for going outside. Um, and that's true in a lot of different kinds of very demanding professions. So specialties have a natural inclination to just focus because they got to keep up. They have to keep up with a demanding and dynamic world. Um, I think that explains a lot, and plus again, there's a comfort level. Everybody in a particular specialty, they understand the problems, they understand each other, they have a common vocabulary, they know it's easy for them to develop conversations around common issues, concerns that they have. So that explains, I think, why they don't cross-ventilate very easily. On the other hand, I will say many of the real innovations that are happening, for example, in medicine, happen because people are crossing those divides, those specialties. Teams working together, made up of people who are combinations of not only medical doctors but also engineers who can help facilitate technology, understanding technology and how that might be able to solve this particular problem. It's social scientists getting involved to help the doctors understand what the patient is really experiencing, because doctors often forget that. Social scientists can really be helpful in helping the team, which is developing a new procedure, let's say, to address a particular common ailment. Uh, it requires lots of different or benefits from lots of different skills because they can draw on their expertise in a very complex um, system is our medical system in this country, uh, probably in yours too. And so I think most innovation we know happens not because people are smart. Most innovation happens because people are recombining things that they knew that were known in different parts of a knowledge base, and they combine them in new and different ways. But they can't do that unless they reach out and hook, kind of connect up with people who are in those various corners, who have better understanding. What we found, for example, in this large microchip manufacturing company, that very large international firm that made chips that were very specialized. So they were fabricated to they weren't generic chips that go into computers and so on. They were very specialized chips that made everything in your life smarter, your toaster smarter, your car smarter, and so on. And so they really, their market was making chips that were um, very particular to a problem. Those problems, though, can be quite complex. What the firm found was that these high-priced, innovative PhDs in all these different areas were not helping them generate new ideas. They were not developing new patents as much as they expected. And they asked us to come in and look at that. And when we did, what we found was that some were very productive. Some were generating patents like crazy. And some, even though they were very specialized and wonderfully uh, well educated and trained in highly lucrative fields, lucrative technologies, what we found was that those that were embedded in cross in area that were connected up with people who were in areas that were not similar to them, but were also embedded in a team. So it wasn't just dyadic. They had to have a team of at least three people that helped them coalesce. So it's a combination of creating a kind of team group spirit that that they enjoyed working with, but also people that were made up from different areas, even physically different locations, literally labs from around the world, different labs from around the world. That those are the people that generated the most innovative and lucrative ideas for the firm in terms of patents. Now that was a firm that was highly reliant on that kind of innovation, constantly producing new patents, new ideas. When you're in that kind of environment, being able to reach across those disparate areas is becomes really important. So I think I the solution, and this is an important lesson too. The solution is not generic. The solution is not everybody should develop ties with everybody else in the organization, wherever they are. We call that the spaghetti organization. The spaghetti organizations don't really exist, and they wouldn't be very effective if they were. You need some local ties also, but if and being more spaghetti-like is not in every organization's interest. It really depends on the dynamic nature, the nature of the technology, the nature of how fast changing the world is around them that they have to keep up with. All of these things play a part in what the right strategy is going to be in terms of what the best kind of network play strategy should be for the firm to be effective in the long run.
Professor, you specifically call out that companies are missing learning opportunities. Can you give us a concrete picture of what a missed learning opportunity looked like inside a large organization and what it cost?
Wow, that's a big question. Um, I'll tell you a couple things come to mind when I think of that question. Um, One is that you're missing learning opportunities if you if you don't really break out of the natural silos. Uh, and I'm thinking of Werner von Braun. Do you know? I don't know if you know who Werner von Braun was. He was a rocket scientist, and he was America's. He was after World War II. He was a German rocket scientist during World War II. The Americans got him before the Russians did, and so he became an American rocket scientist, and he developed our rocket program. Military at first, that's what he was working on. But then when the Russians put Sputnik, in orbit, uh, Eisenhower got spooked and assigned and had decided that we better get into the space race. And so he put Werner von Braun in charge of our of NASA, of our rocket in our space program, and because we had never put anything into space before, and Werner von Braun seemed like he had the technology. Now Werner von Braun also was a kind of a showman. He liked public, so he would have press conferences. They would, and they. I remember as a little kid. On the news, there would be this rocket that would go up and it would shake and shake, and as it was going up, and then it'd spin around and blow up on the launch pad. And then the next day it would go up a little bit further and then spin around and blow up. And people started asking him during during the during the press conferences. They asked Werner Brown, "Aren't you discouraged by all the failures?" And he says, "Are you kidding me? I learn a lot more from my failures than I do my successes." And that became a principle that guided our rocket program for years and years that actually SpaceX is still doing. That is, you want to you want to be pushing the envelope and doing things you're not comfortable with in order to be able to learn from them. Uh, And I think a lot of organizations, when the missed opportunities is because of the comfort level of keeping the silos separate so that there's no conflict, don't have failed to recognize that conflict and failures and difficulties are the real learning opportunities. And I think, again, I think SpaceX is a great example of, I mean, one thing Musk does that's pretty amazing is he pushes the rockets until they blow up. And if and when he was first developing the Falcon, um, he says the rockets aren't blowing up fast enough. You're not pushing them fast enough, and we're not learning from too many successes in a row. We're still in this learning stage, and I think um, that experimentation, exploration beyond our comfort level is an opportunity and not really something that should be shied away from. And I think organizations like to be too comfortable sometimes.
Professor, if the natural default of employees is to cluster with familiar peers, what design
Mm,
choices in platforms, incentives, or culture can actually nudge people toward sharing knowledge across boundaries?
right. That's a good question too. In a sense, what that question translates to is how do you manage the network? How do you influence the network? And quite honestly, networks are not managed like organizational charts. You can manage those. You can reorganize people. You can say you are now reporting to that person, and you go, okay, and everybody does it. Networks are things that sort of emerge between the cracks of an organization. They're natural things that happen without any planning, and they're different. You can't order people to be friends. You can order somebody to be somebody's subordinate. You can't order people to be friends. You can't order people to trust somebody else. Those are things that happen that emerge in a natural process in organization. But you can do things to encourage it. And one of the big levers is the law of propinquity. So if you find that there's a real gap between these two groups, there are a couple things and you want more coordination, you want more interaction between these two groups. You can physically put people in offices that are closer together, and that works remarkably well. That increases the probability. That's so using the law of propinquity. Another is projects. Set up a project that forces people from different disciplines or different areas to work together. Matrix organizations are like that. The only problem with matrix organizations is too often those projects become reified and they become so long term that you're not building new networks that way. I've seen Goldman Sachs used to have this policy. They recognize that a lot of their innovations happened because people in investment banking were talking to people over in fixed income and so on, and developing new derivatives and new examples of new instruments. And they realized that they would benefit from a lot more cross-fertilization. So what they did was they paid for people they paid what they called the power breakfast. And they would pay for your breakfast at a very fancy schmancy breakfast place if you had breakfast with somebody who's not part of your work group. You had to literally make plans to have breakfast with somebody who's in some other part of the department or some other department. And then Goldman Sachs would pay for it. Um, Other firms that I think policy has worked pretty well is simply develop as part of the review process, one of the items on which you're evaluated is how collaborative are you with somebody in other parts of the organization? how well do you work? Or and again, what 360s do is force people to get feedback from other parts about kinds of relationships they have elsewhere. And just by asking those questions, what you're doing is sending a signal to everybody that that's important, and that's going to be important in terms of your future. Even though those things are very difficult to measure, how successful you are at doing that, and the measurements are not really very are often not very good or concrete or reliable. But just asking the question gets people to understand that it's a signal that it's important to the organization, and it gets them to pay attention, and it helps develop an incentive to be more cooperative, to reach out, to go beyond their local siloed boundaries. So those are some ideas, but basically, I would say, don't overmanage. Uh, you, you know, all you can do is lay the foundation where you're increasing the probability that you'll build some bridges from over here to some bridges over here. But you can't order, as I say, you can't order people to be friends. It doesn't work.
Professor, senior leaders often champion knowledge sharing platform as a strategic investment. But if silos persist anyway, where does leadership accountability lie in making these communities truly work?
Uh, huh. That's a really good question. Um, I would say I would say that what you need to do is is a combination of things. There's no simple answer to this. It's not just leaders saying we need to do this. I think technology actually can help, because if you can facilitate information flow across departments, that can help grease the skids, so to speak, and make it easier for people to connect up across different areas. But it's not sufficient. I think leaders have they can do the kinds of things I was already talking about. That is, make opportunities for people to interact and form relationships with others outside there. Leaders can do that because they can say, we're going to put together a project team. Leaders can also do that by example. And I think signaling is a very important part of this process. When people see leaders working collaboratively with somebody completely outside their area of expertise, that sends a signal to everybody else. So it's not only leaders setting up opportunities for other people for their subordinates to develop these relationships, but also publicly engaging in those kinds of relationships as a signal to everybody else. That can really help. I think that would be my that would be certainly my first recommendation to them.
Professor, given your deep expertise in organizational network analysis, how can companies use network mapping to actually visualize where knowledge is flowing and, more importantly, where it is not?
Right. Well, that's a really good question. And I will say two things about that. One, um, there are network mapping tools that you can certainly that are just plentiful now, and you can easily get literature on that, and just Google it, and you'll find all kinds of resources and consultants who will be happy to help you, I'm sure. Uh, but I will say that one of the most common mistakes that organizations make is they think that there is a magic set of questions they should ask. like advice or friendship or trust or just communication or something like that. My experience is the questions that you need to ask and map about are not those core questions that are most common, but the most important question you could ask in your firm is what is the right question to ask? That's the most important question. And that depends on the culture of the firm. Every firm is different. Different firms operate different ways. In that high-tech company I was talking about making chips, their interaction patterns had nothing to do with trust per se. Their interaction patterns were very technical, deep, kind of asking very technical kinds of questions that required going beyond what their own expertise was able to might be able to address. That's a very different kind of network than I find in, for example, in an investment bank, where trust actually is very important, or a military organization where trust can be a trust of a different kind of trust is very different, is very important. Um, so the culture of the organization really helps you to determine what questions you want to ask. One of my favorite things to do in an organization, though, when I'm trying to help an organization, the management develop an understanding of what I like to sit down with the top management. I ask them two questions. I say, first of all, what would you like this organization to look like in terms of networks? Where should the network ties be? Should they be dense here and so on? And then I get them to answer that on a very concrete level. It might even be person to person, or it might be group to group, depending on how high the manager is. But I get that, and I put that concretely into the computer, and the computer can then draw what their desired picture is. And then I say, what do you think it looks like? What does it look like now? And then they tell me that, and the same kinds of questions, but different people are connected. And that tells me where they think the holes are. You can show them directly. All right, you said you think it's here. And then what I do is go down and ask people what the real network looks like. And so often the learning comes from the fact, once you figure out what the important network questions are to ask, going down and asking them, then showing to top management, here's where the real holes are. It's very different from what they thought it was. And also sometimes people, and sometimes they can learn, top management can learn by asking the people themselves down on the floor or in the rest of the organization that they're responsible for, what they think the network should look like. One of my favorite questions to ask, which can be very informative, is what I call the cry for help picture, the cry for help question. And it goes like this: Deepak, if I were to interact with you more than I do right now, would I be able to do my job better? Would I be able to do it more effectively, more efficiently? If the answer to that is yes, I check your name. And then I go through everybody else and check their names. If I interacted with them more than I do now, would I be able to do my job better? And so I get all that information from everybody. And then I ask a second question. I ask myself, I say, Krackhardt, if you were to interact with Deepak more than you do now, would Deepak be able to do his job better? And if so, check his name. And then over Alice, would she be able to do her job better? Then check her name, and so on. And then what I do is I draw a picture that is an arrow from Deepak to me. If and only if both Deepak and I agree that if only we interacted with each other more than we do right now, I would be able to do my job better. If you have a well-run organization, you'll have no lines on the cry for help picture. Because if we both agree that if only we could only interact more than we do right now, one of us would benefit, and there's no barriers to that communication, we would just interact more so I could do my job better. What these lines indicate, because I've never seen a network that an organization that did not have cry for help lines. What this reveals is all the barriers to communication that can be very helpful to top management in helping them diagnose, geez, I missed this completely in my perception of what this organization should look like. So there's both a should, what's going to make this organization more effective, and what does it look like now? And then from all of that information, you can start developing a strategy of how do we make it better? How to, again, facilitating opportunities for networks to form rather than you don't order networks to form, but you can start developing strategies. And I forgot another strategy that I found works a lot, especially in international organizations that are spread out. Sabbaticals. Sabbaticals help a lot because when you physically go someplace, even though you've had a lot of interaction, you go to one of these other plants in another part of the world and you get to know the people there. And it turns out when you come back home, you then electronic communication really helps to maintain that relationship, even though you don't physically get to see them every day. But there's a case where electronic communication is really helps to maintain it after they get to form a face-to-face kind of set of relations during their sabbatical. Sabbaticals, an interesting question is how long does a sabbatical have to be? And we don't know the answer to that. That's an empirical question. My sense is somewhere between a month to 3 months is long enough to develop these kind of deep face-to-face relationships that you then endure when you come back home. So
Yeah.
those network mapping to help compare where the holes are, to compare where the opportunities are, uh, just visually really helps top management to make those kinds of strategic decisions.
Professor David, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. With AI now capable of surfacing and recommending knowledge across organizational boundaries, do you think technology has finally caught up to the problem your research identified? Or are we still fighting the same structural silos, just with smarter tools?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. And I think AI is dramatically going to change the nature of the workplace. And I'm going to confess, I don't know. I'm willing to guess. I'm willing to admit I don't know. We don't have experience and data that allow us to say with a lot of confidence what the impact is going to be. Um, to date, I will say AI is really good on that informational kind of knowledge. So I don't need to rely on other people for solving instrumental, small technical problems, even big technical problems. AI is good at solving those. So far, AI is not replacing the necessity doing, of building cooperative, trusting relationships that we know are important to date. Will AI be able to better solve that kind of help to facilitate developing cooperative relationships across departments? Will they? Uh, I think we don't know the answer to that yet. The other side is the one side is the trust, the face-to-face trust that gets built between people that is so important in organizations. The other side is the innovation side. So far, what AI seems to do is facilitate the generation of a relatively narrow set of options and alternatives and solutions. Relatively narrow when it's trying to be creative. Compare that to what happens when you have people doing things independently or maybe even collaboratively, then the kinds of ideas that develop our wider array of new ideas, new stories, new kinds of things out of the box. Um, and I say so far because certainly we're not done training AI models yet. But where do AI learns from what's already been done? That's where they are learning. And so what's already been done has already been done. And so they're going to they will naturally tend to reify not as creative out of the box solutions. Now, I say so far because these models are getting better and better. Um, and I don't know what the future is going to bring when it comes to that. Um, I will say, I guess my real thinking is it's one of the great unanswered questions of our age, and that it will keep the next generation of researchers employed because we need to know the answer. We need to know what effect it's going to have. We need to know what kinds of constraints we need to put on there, what the dangers, what the pitfalls are, what the implications are for us and society at large and organizations in general. But it's the technology and the data just aren't in yet for me to feel confident answering that question. I wish I could. No crystal ball on my.
Listeners, Professor David Krackhardt's research is a powerful reminder that technology can open doors, but it takes intentional design and perhaps a deeper understanding of human behavior to ensure those doors are actually walked through. Thank you, Professor David, for helping us to see organizations not just as structures, but as a living networks of relationship. This has been a truly enriching conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Deepak.